Hey everyone, I just want to put a quick disclaimer out there before you start this video. On today's episode and any future episodes, we're discussing topics, beliefs, ideas that can get quite dark, can be quite offensive, and we're touching on subject matter that is quite raw. So if that doesn't sound like something that you can palate or stomach, there's no harm in tapping out of this video and catching another video on the channel that isn't the conspiracy theory iceberg. And on today's episode, we touch on a tragic event where a lot of people lost their lives. So I'm just putting it out there. If that is something that you don't want to go into or don't think you can stomach, please feel free to scroll on. And for the rest of you, welcome back to the Australian conspiracy theory iceberg. This is tier 3. Part 2. So conspiracy theory 6 of tier 3 is Nugan Hand Bank. So Nugan Hand Bank was a bank that was established in Sydney in 1973. And just for context, a merchant bank, it's not like a public bank like Commonwealth or ANZ, no. Merchant banks help big companies, organizations, and extremely wealthy people move money and invest money and grow larger sums of money. Think of a merchant bank as a strategist. So Nugan Hand Ltd was founded by a man named Frank Nugan, and he was an Australian businessman and an Australian lawyer. And his partner was a man named Michael Hand, and Michael Hand was a Vietnam vet and a CIA operative, and these two came together and created this merchant bank in Australia. Now what's crazy is just because Nugan was founded and incepted in Australia, at its peak, it had spread worldwide. It could be found in countries like Hong Kong, Germany, Switzerland, Thailand, the Philippines. It could be found in the Cayman Islands. It had spread everywhere. So this merchant bank, it had enormous reach worldwide, and this is even further cemented by some of the names that were linked to this merchant bank. Some of the people on the board for the bank and some of its main advisors were quite decorated people. There was a former CIA director on the board for the bank, William Colby, retired US admirals Earl Yates and Noel Gaylor. Even senior Pentagon figures like General Edwin Black could be found in the board for the Nugan Hand Bank. Now obviously there is a conspiracy theory surrounding this bank, but I needed to just give you a little bit of information just to warm the minds up a little bit. Because in 1980, in Lithgow, New South Wales, Nugan was found dead in his car. Now it's not just as simple as Frank Nugan was found shot in the head in his vehicle in Lithgow. No, think about some of the names that were on the board. Think about some of the countries where the people that were on the board come from, because this is where conspiracy theories start to create. So Frank Nugan was found dead in his vehicle. He had been shot in the head, and not too far from his vehicle, a rifle was found. Now it is extremely important to note that when the police went and investigated this, Nugan's car was not empty. It was filled with vast amount of cash. It was filled with multiple CIA documents, multiple business cards of CIA members, multiple names of high political people. This alone raises conspiracy theories. Now what's strange is, when Frank's body was found, the police said that it was a self-inflicted bullet wound, that Frank had taken his life. But this is where things start to get even stranger and stranger, because when the police started to dive into the bank's records and the bank's history, they found something quite strange. The bank had no legitimate model. There was no legitimate profit model for this bank. How is it that this bank had so much reach but had no clear form, no clear foundations of making money? Multiple people would take loans from the bank, but the money would never be repaid. And it could be seen that the bank was moving lots of money through multiple different shell companies, but there were no records of the bookkeeping. And if they did find records of bookkeeping, it was always unfinished. So by now, we're all thinking the exact same thing, right? Well, money laundering. Was this person murdered because he was laundering money? Well, if that was one of your thoughts, you are bingo on the money, because the journos at the time came to the same conclusion. You see, they believed that the bank was involved in moving a lot of money for the gun trade and a huge amount of money for the Golden Triangle heroin trade at the time. Like, this bank was laundering so much money and moving so much money, but managing just to have enough veil over them to stay out of congressional oversight. Like, it was invisible. And when a royal commission was conducted, they found that this bank posed a huge threat to national security. So at this point, you might be wondering, okay, so Frank Nugan, the Australian who was 50% of this business, had been murdered. He had a car full of money, full of CIA documents. Where was his partner? What happened to Michael Hand, the CIA operative that worked with him? Well, Michael actually fled Australia. He fled Australia with a fake passport and had gone incognito for decades. And decades later, people actually did track down Michael Hand, and he was living back in America under a false name, a new alias with a completely different lifestyle, and he managed to avoid any prison time or any extradition for what was found in the documents when this bank was investigated. So why did I want to tell you the story of Nugan Hand Bank in Tier 3 of the conspiracy theory iceberg? One, because no one really knows what happened to Frank Nugan, but it's a little bit deeper than that too. I just want you to think about what's come out recently in the millions of files that have now become public. I just want you to think about how these types of circles operate as well, and how the rich and the powerful manage to have allies in every country, businessmen, operatives. I think I wanted to add Nugan Hand Bank on this part of the tier because me, a simple YouTuber, I believe that there's a lot more companies in Australia, around the world, that are operating the exact same way this bank did, for the exact same clientele. You see, I'll just say it wouldn't be the first time that huge amounts of money have just vanished into thin air. And as conspiracy theories go, people believe that it was not a self-inflicted bullet wound that ended Frank Nugan's life, but something much more sinister, much more nefarious, and something a lot more set up. Conspiracy Theory 7, Exposethe28, or the list of the 28. So this theory claims that there is a list of 28 Australians, and on this list of 28 Australians, there is a former Prime Minister, there are judges, there are extremely high-profile businessmen. Now, how the claim goes is that the 28 names, the 28 figures on this list are allegedly involved in a huge abuse ring. As always, team, you know how this works. Certain words will get the video tanked or get it taken down, but we're all on the same wavelength, which is always pretty amazing, to be fair. We're always on the same wavelength, and I've noticed that a lot of you that are enjoying consuming this content, you can read my blanks pretty easily. You know how to piece together exactly what I'm saying without me saying it, which runs extremely smooth, and there's going to be a few topics throughout this video where just piece it together, and you know how to. Now, this theory really started to blow up and gain traction in 2015 when a former Liberal senator for New South Wales named Bill Heffernan, he actually claimed that he had this list of 28 names. Now, at the time, Bill Heffernan, who you may remember, he actually stated that he received this list from a former police officer, investigator, or an informative on the inside. He had gotten this information from somebody on the inside. Now, one of the main things that Bill was linking the 28 names to was an alleged, an alleged boy broth that was operating in the King's Cross area. Sometimes we just got to risk it, right? Because this series, it's not always going to be glamorous and glamorized. It's dark and it can get sadistic. Now, Bill had claimed that he had actually given this type of information to the Royal Commission. He claimed that he had given a lot of documentation revolving around institutionalized SA in Australia to the Royal Commission. So people assume that Bill is talking about the list of 28 people, Exposethe28. People assume that that is what Bill had given forward. Now, as it currently stands, though, there is no public information stating that the Royal Commission ever received this list of 28 names. However, the water starts to get a little bit murky here, so let's dive into it. Because we need to address something, and we all need to understand something, and this accounts for everyday life as well. Just because the public are not informed about something does not mean that it has not happened. It does not mean that the public know every truth. We just don't. So what I like to do is dig into these rabbit holes and see if we can find why this conspiracy theory has legs. So let's get into it. Australia was in the middle of a royal inquest into institutional SA in Australia, and some of the findings were absolutely horrific. We had some serious problems in this country. For the sake of avoiding certain words, we'll say that this inquest discovered that Australia had a lot of Epsteins. Epsteins is good. That's going to be the word, because you know exactly how to link it. And the horror is there were tens of thousands of young'uns that were affected in Australia from these findings, and they ranged from schools to churches to sporting clubs to government facilities and institutions. There were so many young ones affected. After this video, if you go back through my discography on YouTube, you can find a video which is The Horrors of Near Cole Orphanage. This was one of those institutions that was doing that exact thing. It's a dark video, but if you want a little bit more information surrounding how some of these systems worked, you'll be able to find it there. And in my opinion, there's another big driving factor that surrounds the 28 file and gives it legs. Now, that factor is that in the 80s and 90s in New South Wales, there was a huge presence of crime syndicates, primarily around the King's Cross area. Think of King's Cross back then as Australia's red light district. That's the easiest way to describe it. So what really fuels this fire is that the inquest into the King's Cross area, it did unveil that there were multiple police officers that were on the payroll, and these police officers would do everything in their power to let these crime syndicates operate without ever getting caught and fly under the radar. Their job was to make them invisible. It was to remove any evidence that could come back to them. It was to sour investigations. These police officers really were blockers for the real people out there trying to look after us. And as stated earlier, this inquest also did discover that it is a fact that Australia had a lot of Epsteins, and there were tens of thousands of people affected by these Epsteins. And I think that's where this conspiracy theory comes from, because then in 2015, when Heffernan came forward and he referenced this list of 28 high profile people that were linked to some of the horrors that would occur in King's Cross, and he was throwing reference to this secret boy broth in King's Cross, it really started to spark people's ears and get their attention. And I found this so interesting, but when Heffernan was referencing this secret club, right, it amazed me how many people right away who were around at the time, they knew the name of the club that they thought this was happening at. That's the reputation that this location had. I can guarantee you that some people watching this right now 100% know the name of the location that Heffernan was referencing. They may even be kind enough to drop their opinions below. So all of this really does start to bring Australia's dark history into question, and now we have to ask the question, well, does the list exist? These claims were made in a parliamentary setting, and being in a parliamentary setting has a form of protection, you see. You cannot be sued for what you say in Parliament. Parliamentary privilege allows members to speak freely. What I find fascinating is that these parliamentary privileges do not extend outside of Parliament. You are not safe outside of Parliament. It does not protect somebody from publicly publishing names. And it doesn't protect media outlets either from reporting on these things. So if Heffernan was to come out tomorrow and release these 28 names, he would get not just sued, but he could get locked up for a very long time. And a lot of people that believe in this conspiracy theory will say that is why he has kept it quiet. My question also is this: if it is true that Heffernan submitted this list to the Royal Commission, why is it not public? Why was nothing done? So I investigated that as well. So what I found out that was interesting was in Australia, the courts, they can issue suppression orders. They can issue non-publication orders. And you see, these orders, they can be issued to protect victim identities, they can be issued to protect specific forms of evidence, and they can be issued to protect national security. That has got to be one of the biggest driving factors that fuels this conspiracy theory. What's even crazier is these suppression orders, they can be in lasting effect from 20 years to 75 years to 90 years to 99 years of suppression. So, theoretically speaking, Heffernan could give some information in 2015 that could be locked up for 99 years. And because he is no longer in Parliament, he wouldn't be able to speak on the information that he shared. That is the conspiracy theory. This next conspiracy theory 100% just needs to be on tier 3, and that is psychic children and mind control or mind control research in Australia. So let's start with the one that's not a theory. In the 1950s, the American government took part in MK Ultra. If you've never heard of MK Ultra, I'll give you a little bit of context. MK Ultra was a secret program run by the CIA to focus and experiment on mind control. And as the CIA were running a lot of these experiments, a lot of the victims of MK Ultra, they didn't even realize that they were in an experiment. This would range from prisoners of war to hospital patients to military personnel. MK Ultra was huge. Funnily enough, in the 1970s, when MK Ultra finally did come to the surface and it was admitted to be real, the government also admitted that a lot of the documentation around MK Ultra was destroyed. So must have been a leak in the plumbing or something like that that destroyed them all, or a fire, something like that. That in itself creates a problem, because once you realize that the government did participate in seeing if they could control people's minds, well, I like to ask the question, what if they succeeded? What if MK Ultra never did fail? What if it just changed? What if MK Ultra evolved and grew into something completely in plain sight but invisible at the same time? I just at times like to ask the question, well, what didn't make it into those files? What was destroyed? And you see, while a lot of people might know about MK Ultra, what a lot of people don't realize is that the US military actually funded psychic research in people. This was known as the Stargate Project, and for years people wanted to see if psychic abilities could be used for espionage. The Stargate Project really focused on remote viewing and astral projection, and it's pretty fascinating. It's pretty crazy to think that the governments believed this enough to put a lot of money towards it, you see. And there were people that came forward later on in life and said that, you know, they recall some of the experiments that were conducted on them, and they remember seeing Soviet stations and things like that. Now, it could be the fact that they were being intoxicated, but maybe it worked. And then you've got the Montauk conspiracy theory, which is a conspiracy theory that circulates around Montauk in New York. Now, I know we're focusing on America here, but we need to understand something, because this is something that not everybody focuses on, but Australia and America are very, very prominent in sharing intelligence. We are a part of Five Eyes, intelligence sharing. So funnily enough, the Montauk Project was actually the original name for the series Stranger Things, because Stranger Things was based on the conspiracy theory, or the theory of the Montauk Project. This is a video that people claim to be released from this project. Conspiracy theorists claim that this footage is real, but they also claim that the Montauk Project worked. And they also claimed that a lot of the institutional abuse that was occurring in Australia at the time was directly linked to this project. It was linked into unlocking these psychic abilities in children, because that was one of the core staples, fundamentals, and foundations to unlocking this part of the brain, this power. So a lot of people out there to date believe that Australia was involved in mind control, MK Ultra, and psychic espionage, or the attempt to create psychic soldiers. Before we jump into the last two conspiracy theories, everyone, I'd love to know in the comments below, would you like it if maybe once a week, just to get some more content moving, if I covered like an Australian true crime story, or, you know, did like an analysis or a breakdown on some Australian cases, sort of like linked around this type of stuff? Like, I was thinking maybe we could like tackle, you know, just like a 10-15 minute analysis and breakdown on like the Snowtown murders, for example, stuff like that. If you'd like that extra bit of content, let me know, because these conspiracy theories, they take a lot longer, but I think I can muster up to probably get some extra content happening every week. So if that is something that you would actually watch and be interested in, let me know. Or if you got a better suggestion, just hit it down in the comments. That'd be unreal, as always. The next conspiracy theory on this list is that the Port Arthur Massacre was a setup. So on the 28th of April 1996, 35 people were murdered and another 23 were wounded in the Port Arthur Massacre, a massacre that took place in Port Arthur, Tasmania, and has gone down in history as Australia's deadliest massacre. Now, these 35 people were murdered in Port Arthur by a man named Martin Bryant. Now, this arguably could be one of the biggest conspiracy theories in all of Australia that people all talk about but don't talk about. A lot of conspiracy theorists these days will claim that Port Arthur was a false flag, an engineered event, if you will. Now, a lot of the information surrounding this conspiracy theory actually comes from Paul Moder's, I believe it is, Wasp Files podcast. So we'll dive into some of the claims that Paul has put forward. Now, Paul has actually gone public with these claims, not just on his own profile, but he's actually been platformed by Sam Newman on his podcast as well. So I recommend everyone that wants to look into this a little bit more, go check out those podcasts. Now, the way that these beliefs go is that Port Arthur was an engineered event, and it was an event that was created to disarm a nation, to bring in rapid gun reform. Now, like every conspiracy theory that I touch on, I like to dive into the mind of the believer and try to understand and contextualize where some of these beliefs come from. And there is a historical precedent for why people think like this. So in 1964, during the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the US, they had came forward and told Congress that their warships had been attacked, when in reality, one of those attacks never actually happened. You see, this claim that one of these warships was actually attacked when it wasn't, helped push through emergency powers that allowed the Vietnam War to escalate without a formal declaration. And years later, the government came forward and admitted that this information was misinterpreted. Now, this isn't saying that everything that occurs in the world is a setup. It's not. Alright, it's not. Not everything in the world is a setup, but it helps give some context to why people go to this belief system when something occurs that results in rapid political change, why people stop and start to ask questions. So there's multiple different claims around the Port Arthur Massacre, and one of the claims is that there were multiple shooters. There are people out there that have made the claims that it wasn't Martin Bryant that they saw shooting that day. Another claim is that the style of shooting was professional, military style. The Wasp Files also point towards a lot of eyewitness contradictions. I think one of the key pieces that people go to, though, when they're discussing this conspiracy theory is the suppressed evidence. You see, because Martin Bryant had pled guilty, there was no jury trial, no public testing of evidence, no coronial inquest in the usual sense, and no royal commission. And that's not just spoken about by the Wasp Files. Even mainstream journalists will lean towards that as well and ask questions surrounding some of the evidence. Now, when it does come to the Port Arthur theory, if you want to go down the rabbit hole and really dive into that one, I would recommend just go check out the Wasp Files, because they've got a lot more information surrounding this, and they go into this in a lot more detail, because that is one of the only theories that they really focus on, or the only theory that they focus on. So they've put a lot more time into garnering a big list of information that they believe points in a certain direction. Conspiracy Theory 10, Julian Assange. For some people, Assange is a hacker who endangered the lives of many. But to others, Julian Assange is the man who pulled the curtain back on how the world really works. Now, if you recall back to tier 2 of the conspiracy theory Iceberg, where we discussed the family, well, one of the conspiracy theories is that Julian Assange is actually in this photograph. Now, Assange has never come forward and said that is him in the photo. That is a conspiracy theory. But it is true that there was a time when his mother was actually dating somebody in the family cult. So as a child, he was exposed to some of the ramifications of this cult, and they actually ended up fleeing. It's all a web. Everything seems to just link in. However, that is not what Julian Assange is known for. No. You see, back in 2006, Julian Assange, he created a website known as WikiLeaks. And the idea of WikiLeaks, it was so simple yet so powerful. Anyone behind the veil, anyone inside the system, military personnel, diplomats, they could leak documents and evidence anonymously to WikiLeaks. And WikiLeaks were publishing these documents for the entire world to see. And in 2010, WikiLeaks released hundreds of thousands of US military documents. And that was from war logs to embassy cables to internal reports. And in all of that information, there was one video that was released really blew the lid off a lot of people. You see, one of the documents contained the collateral murder footage, and this footage showed a US Apache helicopter opening fire on a big group of men in Iraq. And in that group of men, there were a lot of journalists, a lot of civilians. Now, that wasn't just a viral video. That was a video that changed the way that the public see things. It changed the way that people perceive war. And overnight, Assange went from just an activist to one of the most wanted men in the entire world. Now, this is where the first part of the conspiracy theory comes from, because in 2010, there were allegations from 2 Swedish women that Assange had assaulted them. Now, at the time, Julian had denied any wrongdoing, and a lot of Julian's supporters will say this was a way to silence him. This was a way to discredit him because he had so much information, because he was the one who created WikiLeaks. Now, where Assange's fear came from was that if he travelled to Sweden whatsoever, he could be extradited to America and imprisoned. Now, Julian was trying to avoid America at this point because of what he had shown the public. And it was at that point that Julian Assange did something crazy. He walked into an Ecuadorian embassy in London, and he stayed in that building for 7 years. If you haven't noticed, for Tier 3, we're painting together conspiracy theories that have really affected the way that the world consumes media, and the way that a lot of people in the world started asking more questions than just accepting answers. We have to focus on the Julian Assange case and everything that had happened to him and the living hell that he went through, because this is one of the first times, I believe, that the public opened their eyes to the belief that the government will try to remove certain people for speaking out of line or for sharing things that they want kept secret. And so, my friends, I'll leave you off with this one. If I ever vanish, it was against my own will. I will continue making YouTube videos, and I love making YouTube videos, and I'm not planning to go anywhere putting it out there. Everyone, thanks so much for tuning in. I want to apologize if you can't tell, I'm a little bit sick at the moment, but I really wanted to get this video out for everybody. I really wanted to just knuckle through and get this filmed and edited, because I love doing this series as much as you love consuming it. So thank you so much, and thanks for, putting up with me being a little under the weather. The biggest compliment is you just being here and watching the content, and that is the most support I could honestly ask for. So if you want me to dive into some certain theories and stuff like that, just comment it down and let's dive into it as a community and have some fun with it. I just love making these videos and talking about strange, obscure things in the world and scary ghost stories and stuff like that. So honestly, guys, just you being here is enough. And I mean that from the bottom of my heart. So thank you.